What is up, everyone? It's your boy Shaft, aka That Mill Guy, coming at you with a video that, you know what, I think I want to start making videos like this to kind of keep in the eternal repository, one that y'all can link to maybe newer players or just kind of go back to in terms of kind of thinking about cards and whatnot. And really what the topic of this video is a definitive guide to counterspells in Modern Mill. That's right, I'm going to be going through all of the counterspells that have been played in Modern Mill throughout its history to some level of reasonable success. And that's the key. There's a lot of counterspells that can be played, and there's a lot of ones that come close, but over the years, some have really fallen flat, and I'm not really going to mention them. Some have actually had some level of success, even if not a great amount, so I do want to bring those up as well. If there's a counterspell on this list that I'm not bringing up, it's mostly because I don't think it's going to be that great, or honestly, there is a small probability that I may have just missed it. So let me know in the comment section down below if I have, but even if you haven't, give me the counterspell that I haven't talked about, and I'll try and give you my reasoning for it. Also, please take note of the date of publishing of this video. If a counterspell is really good and I haven't talked about it, heck, it could have just been printed after the publishing of this video, and I gotta update this, so look out for that as well. So we're going to be going through a bunch of counterspells, so chapters in the timeline below and in the description if you want to get to a specific counterspell and link it to someone. Hope you enjoy the meme up here, and let's get right into it with the first one. Oh, always gotta do this. There you go. Fresh out of Scryfall, first and foremost, we have Spell Pierce. 1 blue mana, instant, counter target non-creature spell, unless it's controller plays 2. Non-creature spell, enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, instant sorceries, you know, all that good stuff you're going to be able to hit with Spell Pierce. The big problem right now, I guess, for this card specifically, is that it's really nowadays only used as a one-of surprise factor. You used to have to be able to, or used to be forced to play around Spell Pierce before the days of Mystical Dispute. But nowadays, most of the time, if you're playing something like Spell Pierce, you're usually playing it against a blue deck or some type of combo strategy. And against those combo strategies, you usually have other levels of counter magic that you can use against them. And Spell Pierce is nowadays used as a one of, again, just to surprise people outside of your usual spell suite of Mystical Disputes and stuff, which we're going to talk about later. So in Mill, you want to be as effective as possible with your counter magic. You want it to be targeted and you want it to be as strong as possible, which is why most of the time I'd rather play something else that's on this list, or honestly just Mystical Dispute, which again is later on this list. I wouldn't be terribly upset with playing a card like this. I would just find in certain scenarios with some very powerful, kind of more flexible counterspells that exist out there, you would get a lot more mileage from a spell that costs maybe even one more than this one. So definitely something to still consider. It's just not something that I'm really reaching for initially. You know what I mean? Next up, we have something like Dispel. Now, this one has, I guess, fallen out of favor. The modern meta has really become creature heavy in a lot of ways. So strictly spell-based strategies are, I almost want to say, a thing of the past. A lot of interaction, thanks to even decks like Elementals coming out of Modern Horizons 2, have become more creature heavy. The interaction exists in the creature suite. If we even think of a card like Shark Typhoon changing the way that we interact with the game, an enchantment on the top end, drawing cards and creating creatures and stuff like that, there's a lot of ways to interact with your opponent outside of instants and sorceries, in this case specifically instants. So Dispel, I think there's a world where a card like this will come back into favor. If you were playing something like Legacy, I would definitely be a lot more about this card than I am now in Modern. But you know, you're not completely getting rid of these. You're keeping them in your binder for the day that the usefulness of this card comes back. But for now, I'm not really sleeving up this card. I'm not feeling Dispel. If you're wanting to play something like this, you could probably better tune your counterspell package towards a wider meta instead of just trying to say, I have this against their counter magic or whatever. You can do a little bit better. Annul. This one was from, I want to say, Modern's past. Kind of more so in the days of Mox Opal. And it's kind of surprising to me, you know, I guess not in a big way, that with the rise of Enchantress, that this ever so happened to be in the conversation again. But of course, Enchantress snuck back down, and so something like this just becomes a very tough sell. just because, again, artifact strategies aren't terribly big in the meta right now. Again, ever since the banning of Mox Opal, that's definitely been a thing, and we did see the slight rise of Affinity come back after Modern Horizons 2, but it didn't really stick around. So there isn't really a reason to play a card like this right now. Obviously, in other formats, we're thinking of something like Pauper. A card like this is actually relatively powerful, where Affinity is a tier 1 strategy. But for now, something like Annul isn't really relevant to us. We want to deal with instant and sorceries, non-creature spells, specifically Planeswalkers, and yeah, creatures. And we want removal for them. So something like this, keep it in the back of your pocket. Right now, Modern's not at that state, and I don't think that's how WotC wants to curate the format. So, keep it where it is. You don't need it in your sideboard. Ceremonious Rejection. Now this one, I want to bring this card up because I think it's relatively important, because there's always going to be a semi boogeyman to fight with this card, and that's going to be not Tron, Eldrazi Tron. Yeah, so not green Tron. I'm talking about Stompy, Chalice of the Void, Eldrazi Tron. And this is going to be interesting just because the downside being that it doesn't get around Chalice on 1. Okay, so you're not going to be able to beat that, but it's a very efficient way to beat Chalice on the stack if you're able to get this in your opening hand. And once you eventually do beat Chalice, let's say you're playing Esper Mill, you're playing something like Prismatic Ending, you're able to get rid of it. You're playing something like Sultai Mill, you're playing Abrupt Decay, and you're able to get rid of the Chalice. Then this becomes 1 mana counter everything in their deck. So pretty powerful, especially at an LGS level where you do see 2-3 players playing Eldrazi Tron, and you want maybe a 1-of as an extra piece against them. This almost is a Flusterstorm type card, specifically as a meta call. Now, in terms of modern leagues and modern challenges and kind of the bigger sphere, as of right now, the recording this video, this isn't that relevant. But especially if you're watching this video right now at an LGS level, Ceremonious Rejection has a lot of value to it. Colorless spells, you get in the whole Eldrazi package. There's a lot of spells out there that are surprisingly colorless. So keep this in the back of your mind, especially at a local level where you can do a little bit more predicting. This card comes in and out of favor every so often, especially as a 1-of. So it can't be forgotten. Mana Leak, and now we're kind of slowly getting into the breadth of more and more, I guess, playable counter spells. Now, Mana Leak, obviously in something like Dimir or heck, even Esper, something like this isn't really ideal. In something like Azorius Mill, where now Azorius Mill is definitely being discussed thanks to Wisnia's recent 10-0 finish at the Modern Challenge, winning them the Total Challenge that weekend on the Saturday. It's interesting to think that we don't have black for something like Drown in the Loch, and they weren't playing anything like Counterspell. They were playing something else, which we will discuss later in the video. But Mana Leak's also an option as an easy way to just counter things early. The problem is, obviously, it doesn't hit those 1-drops, which Modern has become very efficient with Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler, and a lot of their interaction pieces like Inquisition of Kozilek, Lightning Bolt, whatever it may be, is also very low to the ground, so you're not really beating those tempo-wise. The control decks and the bigger decks in that aspect aren't really that existent, I would say, and if they are, they're a lot more powerful and a lot more multifaceted. I'm thinking of something like Elementals, where even though you might be able to counter a spell, first of all, they could be playing Cavern of Souls, completely shutting this off, and second of all, they do have a lot of value engines just to keep drawing through their decks and kind of get past you. Think of something like Risen Reef getting around something like this, where in which case you might have been better off playing a more resilient spell that got a spell earlier, or at least you didn't have to put the mana investment into, and in the late game, this can be paid up to, right? So definitely a lot to think about there, but it's probably going to be a counterspell that dies out, but I had to bring it up because people bring it up every so often, especially if they're a little tougher on mana. This is just 1 blue and 1 colorless, but I really think you can do better than this, especially with some of the cards we're going to talk about later. Tail's End. Now this one, I'll always be a big proponent of this card, especially if you wanted to get spicy. Now, I'm not sure where in the meta this is going to be a great call. It really is something that definitely comes in and out, but is always relevant in some way, shape, or form. Countering activated abilities, triggered abilities, legendary spells, whatever it may be. The legendary spell aspect, thanks to the change for Planeswalkers a couple years back, going to be a great way to get rid of those in a Walker-heavy meta. Right now, as the recording this video, it's really just Renin 6. And then obviously against the control strategies, you might be running up against something like Teferi, or even Elementals playing Teferi. But against elementals, you're also hitting stuff like Omnath and whatnot, so that's going to be a great way to deal with stuff like that. But the activated and triggered abilities, that's going to be a great way to deal with planeswalkers that are already resolved. You're trying to counter an ultimate. What about trying to counter a fetch land, a deck that's very greedy with their mana base, and you're trying to get rid of something like that? What if you're trying to get rid of a triggered ability out of a graveyard that might be game winning? That's going to be pretty solid too. So it has its uses everywhere, right? The funny thing that people were doing with this was when Uro was legal in the format, you let Uro enter the battlefield, you would counter its ability, its sack ability with this, and it would just stay on the battlefield, get everything else. So a pretty sweet way back then to get some value out of certain cards, but for now, still a consideration as always. It's just right now you probably just have more efficient spells, but if you're looking for that 15 spell, you really want to get spicy, I can't stop recommending this card. It's a great one. Force and Negation has... This one's been a very controversial spell, let's say, in Mill. When it came out, this was around the Hogak era of things. There's a lot of things that people wanted to deal with off the rip when they're tapped out, and Mill didn't really have a lot of leeway, I should say. A lot of leeway to deal with certain spells and or abilities. But now Modern has evolved in terms of its interaction package, and so we don't need to go through the hoops of card disadvantage for something like this. We're not a control deck, we're not a combo deck, we are a mid-range tempo style strategy. So this type of card disadvantage is really detrimental for a deck like Modern Mill. And again, as of the recording of this video, I would really not recommend playing this card, and I'm pretty sure your wallets are and your Mana Traders accounts are happier for you for me saying that. Because it's a really expensive card, doesn't really provide the value that you need in Mill. The artwork's sweet, it's going to be blinging out in your deck, but Mill does not need this. There aren't effects like this in Modern that you need to shut out when you're tapped out. A lot of the times you could just mulligan a little bit better for better interaction. You could play more interaction, or you could just not get greedy and not tap out without interacting. So it's not necessary. You could build your sideboard a little bit better, maybe even your main board with a little bit more interaction. You won't have to kind of mulligan hard for answers like this and try and trick them when you're tapped out. You don't need that type of 5-head playing, okay? Don't play this. It's not worth it in Modern Mill. Veil of Summer. Now, I gotta bring this card up because it's one of the primary reasons to play Sultai Mill. This is a massive payoff, and in the hubbub of its great days, really, and right now it's still seeing some level of play, really a 1-mana green Cryptic Command. And people still have this joke throughout. It's still a very, pervasive card through it. Like, if you're playing against a green heavy opponent, it's something that you have to expect as a Mill player, or it's something that you have to respect out of that deck in general if they're holding up 1 green. You don't want to get got by this card, and especially, obviously, for those Dimir pilots, everything in your deck gets stopped by something like this. Now, notably, stuff like Ruined Crab, Fractured Sanity, and Tasha's Hideous Laughter do get around cards like this now. So we do have tools against cards like this, and we have to worry less about it. But I'm more so talking about us as Mill players using this against our control opponents, against our removal heavy opponents that want to get rid of our crabs and stuff like that. Fantastic card on top of a counterspell suite that you already have. And that's the key thing that I want to talk about here, where you should not be playing this in replacement of a counterspell package. It's a value engine, sure. You're going to be able to protect your own spells. You're going to be able to let those resolve and protect your own permanents, draw cards, whatever it is. But it ultimately doesn't interact with what your opponent's doing on their turn, if you know what I mean. It's not dealing with the spells that they're casting for themselves. It's dealing with the interaction that they have for you. That's great, but it's not countering the living end that they have. It's not countering the game winning ultimatum that, I don't know why they're playing ultimatums in Modern, but I'm just throwing ideas out there. It's not dealing with stuff like that. It's really a win more protective measure for you. So if you're playing Sultai Mill, you're definitely playing a copy or 2 of this in your sideboard, probably 2 to 3 copies, but this is not a replacement for counter magic such as Mystical Dispute, Aether Gust, whatever cards that we're going to talk about later in this video. You have to play this alongside that stuff, and especially when considering that right now Thoughtseize, Inquisition, or Kozilek isn't as actively played in the meta. Jund has definitely seen a big dip, and I'm talking about Boomer Jund with Liliana the Veil. Right now we have more so mid-range aggro creature-based Jund that will play cards like that, but not in those crazy big amounts where something like this would generally matter in a matchup like that. And of course it could. They are playing fatal pushes and whatnot, and especially against the Grixis Death Shadow matchups where they are playing cards like that 1-mana counterspell and interaction, this could be very helpful. But again, you should also have other counter magic with this card. Flusterstorm, a card that I've recently talked about in one of the top 5 cards that modern mill players should be putting into their sideboards. A great card, as I was mentioning, in the same vein of how you'd play Spell Pierce right now. So Spell Pierce is generally one of catch-all. If you're looking at the way control players are building their current lists right now, you will see this card as a one of. Right? And that's a great way to just catch you out of nowhere. Of course, having Storm, not only is your opponent really not going to be able to interact with this because you're going to be casting multiple copies of this card, but it's also going to be a card that they do not expect. This is a legacy staple. Even though it's modern legal, modern is a multifaceted format full of planeswalkers, full of creatures, full of artifacts, enchantments, and everything else. It's not a format policed by something like Force of Will or Daze. So they're not as common. So Flusterstorm is a great way to win those instant sorcery battles, especially against control opponents, especially against opponents that are tempo decks or whatever, something like is a tempo that you know you'll get into a fight with like that. This is a fantastic way to beat those because they have to deal with each individual copy of the spell. And of course, it's 1 mana. You can't really beat that. So something to really consider in your sideboards if you're looking for specifically a piece against control and really instant and sorcery decks. Let's say at your LGS you have those tried and true Storm players, and you also have control opponents. This is going to be a great one of catch-all, that 15th card, that 14th card, whatever it might be, in your sideboard as a way to deal with those opponents with just one card alongside your other counterspell suite. But just like Veil of Summer, this is not a replacement for your counter magic. It's way too specific for that because of instant and sorceries. It has to be played alongside a very diverse counterspell suite. Ooh. Mystical Dispute, when it was printed, Throne of Eldraine being one of the most powerful sets ever printed in Magic's history, of course, Mystical Dispute changed the game. This is such a sweet on-rate spell. You can cast it for 3. At worst, it's never really quote-unquote a dead spell. It's like slightly overcosted mana leak, which isn't terrible, but especially against blue spells, it's a great costed, much more powerful well, I shouldn't say much more powerful, kind of a more powerful Flusterstorm. A great way to tempo your opponent out. This is the type of advantage that you're looking for as one of your primary counter spells in your sideboard as a modern mill player. Imagine countering Cryptic Commands, Archmage's Charms, heck, even any other blue spell, really, because this also hits stuff like Murktide Regents, Omnats, other blue creatures as well. This hits anything that's blue. This is the type of diversity that you're looking for in a supportive counterspell package that you need on top of Drown in the Loch. This is the type of spell that you need to usually be playing 2 or 3 copies of in your sideboard. Now, obviously, that may wax and wane, but you're looking for a card like this when you're just kind of running out of answers, or if it's a pet card of yours. And what do I mean by that? The counterspell that you're already playing aren't really dealing with the threats that you're trying to deal with effectively. You have got a lot of control opponents, you have a lot of Archmage's Charm, a lot of Murktide Regents. This is a great way on top of removal to deal with Murktide Regents because, again, 1 mana to counter that spell, that's the type of tempo you need. That's how you win the advantage game in Modern these days, and especially with Modern Mill, you want to be as efficient as possible with your mana, especially in the early and mid game. Remember that we're a deck that now casts 3-drop sorceries. Okay, you need to be making sure that the rest of your spells in the game are as efficient as possible, and 1 mana counter spells really as efficient as they can get without the downsides of all the 0 mana counter spells, right? So definitely one to play. I don't think I need to go through this a lot. If you got blue spells in Modern, which is pretty much always, then you should be playing this card. I mean, heck, think about this in the mirror. It hits all parts of the mill package. Aether Gust is definitely a card that grew on me slowly, right? And I was a big arena proponent when this card came out. And this card itself is so goddamn versatile because you just gotta read it. Because it's not actually a counter spell. It doesn't say counter anywhere on it. And that's the beauty of it. Because against especially decks that play Cavern of Souls, this is a great way to interact with them. Those Elementals opponents that play the Cavern of Souls, those, the Titan players that play Cavern of Souls, naming Giant and whatnot, this is a great way to stop those interactive creatures, those spells, right where they are. And the great thing against strategies like those, unlike other counterspells on this list, is it's never really dead as a top deck because it's an interactive spell that also deals with those cards on the battlefield. It says choose target spell or permanent. So spell on the stack, permanent on the battlefield. You got answers for both of those if they are red and green at instant speed. Top of the library, perfect, because then you have something like your Ruin Crab's out, you let them put it on top, and they're like, oh, damn, there's a Ruin Crab out. Too late. By the time they realize that, you got your landfall trigger out, they're milling it over. So they have to decide things like that. Are they going to make you potentially mill one less card that they don't know about by putting it on top and then you get the 2 mill? Or are they trying to save that card? They're going to put it at the bottom and try and shuffle and find it later. That's the type of information that you're looking for, and it's a big way to understand what type of advantage they're looking to get as the turns go on. If they cast a spell from their hand and they're putting it immediately back on top, they're probably recognizing the fact that either you don't have a follow-up spell, in which case a top deck or something hidden in your hand is extremely powerful and detrimental to what they're doing, or they're putting it at the bottom trying to save it and you're realizing, okay, that's the type of effect that they're looking for. Or if they're at a, again, last minute scenario of the game, they're trying to find something effective, that's not the card that they're looking for. They're hoping to draw into something else, and you're just trying to understand at what state they're in. These are the type of reads that you can make with versatile cards like this, and this is honestly almost that ever since the printing of this card, it's a must-have in the sideboard of Modern Mill. Like a lot of green and red strategies, just at the baseline of mono red prowess, burn, you're gonna be able to use something like that. Bigger creature decks, as I mentioned, like Titan and Elementals, you're gonna be able to use something like this. At all stages of Modern, this card is extremely relevant in your sideboard. You should have a copy of this. Right now, I'm playing 2 in my sideboard guide, and I wouldn't go any lower than this. This is an excellent way right now in the Modern metagame to deal with decks like Elementals, heck, even the even the Cascade decks that have green spells that try and use their Cascade spells. It's a great way to deal with stuff like that. So keep it in your sideboards, get your copies, and the full copies of this card are just out the wazoo in terms of price. So if it can tell you how effective and how wanted a card like this is, should be more than enough. Now, Test of Talents, I've spoken the praises of this card endlessly. I love this card. It is such a spice card. No one has hopped on this as the recording of this video. I'm telling you, no one but mill players have hopped on this card. It's so sad. It's like it's almost like a better it's almost like a better counterspell sometimes. Because a lot of times what you just want to do is, this is your supporting cast. This is not your main board. This is your supporting cast. And you're then able to take out spells for combo decks. Imagine exiling all cards of all versions of Live Again. Imagine countering Counterspell from your control opponent and then exiling all copies of that. Archmage's Charm, Lightning Bolts against your aggro opponent. So versatile. Having Surgical Extraction glued onto a counterspell. I mean, y'all know how good Extirpate Surgical is. Your Modern Mill players, put it on a counterspell and just play this card. Play this card as a 2 or 3 of in your sideboard. Test it out for a bit. Come back to this video and tell me how right I am. That's all I'm going to say. Counterspell, nice and simple. As long as this is legal in Modern, it'll always be a contender in Modern Mill. Now, if you're playing something like Esper, which is 3 colors, your slots might be a little tighter because obviously playing white gives you access to a lot more powerful cards in terms of interaction. So you might not have the spells like the slots on top of Drown in the Loch to play something like this. But Dimir Mill will always have a house for something like this. Right now, we're really hoping to skew a little bit more removal heavy in terms of just our interactive package. Now, if the format slows down just a tad bit, then hey, start removing pieces of Fatal Push and stuff like that, and you could play something like Counterspell. And there's obviously a lot of 5-0 lists going on right now that still play something like this, so you can't actually really harp on it. It's a pretty powerful and successful card throughout Magic's history. Not much else to say. Counterspell is Counterspell. This is the OG deal with spell on the stack type of card, and can't really complain. If you're playing something like Azorius Mill, then this is definitely a consideration. But there's a spell that I want to talk about kind of coming up here that is going to be a little more relevant to that discussion as well. But it won't really go away in terms of power until they power creep it, especially as a Dimir player. you know, have 2 to 3 copies lying around. A playset, we're not really there yet. When Modern Horizons 2 came out, we were testing playsets, but then we just found out that the 1-drop creatures and other effective elements that Modern Horizons 2 brought out to us changed the format in the sense that we needed more removal and less really interaction on a stack. Once a permanent like Ragavan or Dragon's Rage Channeler enters the battlefield, Counterspell slowly starts losing its value. So obviously something like Drown in Loch, which we'll talk about in a bit, helps shore that up, but for now, please keep copies of this card. It's always going to be good. It's still proving itself to be good. As we were talking about, Drown in the Loch. Now, I've talked about this card being definitely one of the most powerful cards in Mill's suite of spells, because I don't know if y'all remembered when Throne was released and people saw this card, and you know, obviously this was when no one knew what Oko was going to do and other cards like that. Everyone was more concerned for Standard and how that was going to change. But Drown in the Loch really changed the game. Counterspell on top of a removal spell. There were days, you know, long gone were the days where we were playing murderous cuts alongside of our fatal pushes, and we were playing mana leaks and stuff like that in our main board. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have counter magic. But unequivocally, even when the Path of the Mill player faltered a little bit, they knew deep down in their heart that this has been a playset, slam dunk copy of a card for as long as it's been printed in Dimir Mill. Heck, even in Esper Mill right now, this is a slam dunk copy. Now, obviously, in Azorius Mill, the reason to play that type of archetype is you're starting to get more copies of more interactive spells that provide a little bit more versatility off the stack. I'm thinking primarily Prismatic Ending, but if you got black in your Mill suite, you should be playing 3 to 4 copies of Drown in the Loch. I don't need to explain this any farther. If you're watching this video, chances are you already know how powerful this card is. You're milling over and you're putting cards into your opponent's graveyard 9 times out of 10 because the amount of cards you're putting in there. This is literally just 2 mana Murderous Cut, deal with anything, and this is literally just Counterspell most of the time. Yeah, most of the time, this is exactly what that's going to be. And even if it's not, your opponent's dealing with trying to interact with you in such a way where they might just be ahead and it's fine. It might not save you anyway. They might have a Relic of Progenitus, or you're interacting with them in such a way with something like Soul Guy Lantern and exiling their library where you're already beating them in one aspect. It's fine. They'll put cards back in their graveyard. You'll mill them over a little bit more, and you'll turn this back on eventually after a little bit of exile. So don't worry about it. Play around it. This card will get you that maximum value. I don't need to speak on this card anymore. Y'all know one of the real staples of the archetype. Not even the deck. It's just the archetype in general across Magic. Drown is definitely a staple. And we're finally kind of getting on into the last card here. I believe this is the last card I have on the lineup. I wanted to talk about Remand. And this was really one of my primary pushing factors about talking through this video on the Counterspell suite. I wanted to talk about this because of Wisnia's win with Azorius Mill in the Modern Challenge. And this was their interesting kind of take. Obviously, at first glance, pretty sure 9 times out of 10, everyone would have just said, play 4 Counterspells. You get a hard counter, the card doesn't come back, gets put in their graveyard, adds to the Vision's count, all that good stuff. Remand is really interesting because, especially when you're thinking of the fact that it counters any spell, first and foremost. So creatures, enchantments, artifacts, all that stuff on top of instant and sorceries. Ooh. And on top of that, you're able to then put it back into their hand, which is really relevant, and draw a card. So it replaces itself. So piece number 2. Piece number 1 is it counters anything. Piece number 2 is it draws a card. Replaces itself at instant speed. Pretty good. You're going to be able to keep cycling through your deck. On top of Visions Beyond and Fractured Sanity, when you're playing something like this, you have a little bit more velocity. Now, point number 3, putting the card back into their hand. Now, think about it like this. Especially since Modern Horizons 2, we have a lot more Cascade running around the format. You think of Eliminate strategies. We have a lot more Evoke running around the format. Think of Elementals. Now, when your opponent cascades into a spell, they cascade into Living End. All right? You remand the Living End. You put it in their hand. Wait. Are they then able to cascade? No, they're not able to cascade into that copy of Living End anymore. So if you don't have that Surgical Extraction, or maybe you've already dealt with other copies of Living End, a lot of Living End strats are actually only playing 3 copies of Living End. So let's say you somehow managed to deal with the other 2 copies. and you then are able to remand that last copy, they're done. They're not able to cast that card anymore. They put it in their hand. They now have to suspend it for all that mana. Just essentially just shut out of the game. Right now, obviously, against something like the Living End strategies, they do have Grief. So that is something to be mentioned, where you are putting that card in their hand and you're providing them with a black card to sack to Grief or exile to Grief for them to play that. But that's fine. You're just trying to deal with the first card itself one step at a time. Hopefully you have more answers like Drown in the Loch that we mentioned for cards like Grief. Okay, so we'll leave that step 2 there. Also, against elementals, think about the evoke creatures. They're playing all these evoke creatures by exiling another card from their hand and then playing this at instant speed if it has flash, something like endurance, or they're just playing from their hand at sorcery speed, but they're still trying to cast it for 0 mana. Okay, so remand that evoke spell back to their hand. You counter it, essentially, put it back to their hand, that's fine, and then you draw a card, replace remand. But if they want to cast it again, they have to go through another round of card disadvantage. They have to exile another card from their hand that's of the requirement for that spell. And if they do, that's fine. But think about the type of advantage you just had. You return that card to their hand. They have now exiled 2 cards to play 1 card. You have spent 0 cards. You cast a spell, you spent 2 mana, but you cast the spell and you just replaced it. Pretty good levels of card advantage when we're talking about cards like Mystical Dispute and stuff, where you're tempoing them out, and that's the type of advantage you need when we're casting 3-drop sorceries. Something like Remand is actually really powerful against strategies like that. And that's the kind of modality that you want to think about a card like this. In some matchups, it's just going to be not the best counterspell. That's just straight up true. Right? You're not hard countering, you're putting back in their hand, especially something like Tron. You're not dealing with their lands, you're just putting it back, you're just delaying for a turn. But sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes all you need is that top deck Tasha's, the top deck Fractured, the top deck Field of Ruin for the Dead Archive traps in your hand. That's all you need, that one more turn to then get to the win that you need. So that's how I want to kind of frame Remand to all of you. It's actually really interesting, and it's something that people have been kind of down on, and then once they saw the win at the Modern Challenge, started to see, okay, especially post Modern Horizons 2, it's actually kind of interesting. So I don't know if you would play this necessarily in Dimir or Esper, but if you're playing this in something like Azorius Mill, where you don't have access to Dimir, Drown in the Loch, and you don't have access to the interaction suite of something like other counter magic where you might want to play, Counterspell, or you do have access to it and you're looking for more ways to interact. Remand might just be one of the sleeper, better, top-tier removal spells, counterspells, interactive spells for Modern Mill. Just something to think about there. For now, that's where our video ends. Those are the counter spells that I wanted to talk about in this video. And again, as I said in the beginning, let me know in the comment section down below if there's any card that I missed, and I'll try and answer why I didn't talk about it. Hopefully, I haven't missed anything important. I don't believe I have. And usually if I have missed a spell, it might be relevant, but it hasn't really had that much success in a modern mill strategy in a large number or just to any real degree. Of course, if you're watching this kind of months down the line and the card wasn't printed at the time of this video, let me know. Maybe if enough spells are printed, I gotta update this video, but I thought it'd be a great way to provide that kind of global reach there. Now we're gonna end the video there. Thanks everyone for joining. Remember, even the impossible is possible, and as we ponder that thought, I hope you'll join me next time as we take a glimpse into the unthinkable.